Once the liquidator knows what cash he has to his availability to pay the creditors with, he needs to consider in what order the creditors will be paid. Now, the general principle in the Act is that with the winding up, all debts and claims will rank equally. So if there's insufficient funds, all the creditors should share proportionally in the cash that is available. However, there are many exceptions to the rule, to such an extent that we can categorize the creditors in different categories and rank them accordingly. So we'll see that the first creditors, the group of creditors will be the secured creditors. And that can be split into two groups: secured creditors with a specific charge. So that would be the creditors, for example, a mortgage holder where a specific asset like the building or land has been given as security for that debt when the debt was arranged initially. So those creditors will be paid first, and they normally can claim that asset and to sell the asset on behalf of the liquidator and the whole process. But the proceeds from that asset is then first applied to the debt that is owed to these specific creditors. So the secured creditors with a specific charge. The next category of creditors then are the secured creditors with a floating charge. And that would typically be your debenture holders. So it's holders of debt instruments that where the assets, not a specific asset was given as security, but a general claim on the assets were provided as security when those instruments were issued. That is the first category of creditors, or the secured creditors. The second category is then the preferential unsecured creditors. Now, the group of creditors that will fall under the preferred unsecured creditors are those creditors who are given preferential treatment over the other unsecured creditors. Now, if you look at the list that's given in the Act, it would typically include creditors that result from the court order process or the court order for the liquidation process, so any of the costs that needs to be incurred regarding that, indemnity costs of the administrator. And then what we'll also typically see in this group is creditors that result from payment that is due to employees, superannuation, leave payable, wages, salaries, anything that relates to the remuneration of staff members, retrenchment costs as well. They'll be included in the preferred unsecured creditors. The second last category is then, if I can just wipe out these first. So that was now secured and our preferential unsecured. The next group is then our ordinary unsecured creditors. So these creditors will include your normal accounts payable, so your suppliers that supplied on credit, other creditors like telephone bills and related costs that's due to suppliers to the company. Other examples include rent payable and audit fees payable and GST rates, some of the taxes and so forth. They're all ranked together with ordinary unsecured creditors. So if there's insufficient funds when we get to this category of creditors, they'll all share proportionally in the deficit or the limited funds that are available. The next category is the deferred creditors. Some of the deferred creditors will result from regulation or information contained in the company's constitution. So, for example, if you've got preferential shareholders and the constitution determines that if the dividends have been declared but it's unpaid, that those shareholders has a legal claim to those dividends, then they'll be categorized as deferred creditors. So they'll be paid after all the ordinary unsecured creditors have been paid in full, but before distribution is made to the ordinary shareholders. Also included can be if there's calls in advance that has been paid, those calls in advance are refunded before the ordinary shareholders or any funds are distributed to them. And when you consider who needs to be paid and in what order they're ranking, it's important that you also note that there are some further exceptions. For example, if you're in an insolvent position, so the company that's being liquidated is not in the position to pay their debtors as and when they are due, and they don't have sufficient funds to repay all the creditors, then some of the creditors shift in ranking. One such example is wages and salaries that are due to employees, leave that personnel are entitled to, and retrenchment packages, retrenchment costs. So if it's an insolvent company, these items which would normally be preferential unsecured creditors move up in ranking to above the secured creditors with a floating charge. So they move up after the secured creditors with a fixed charge, but before the secured creditors with a floating charge. A further condition exists with regards to directors and people directly related to the directors. So if you're an insolvent company and you owe money to your directors' salaries, it moves up, that creditor moves up to above the secured creditors with a floating charge, but it's capped to an amount of $2,000. Similarly, regarding the leave for directors, so excluded employees is what the category of staff members who are limited is categorized as, that is limited to an amount of $1,500. So what you'll see in questions is that if the company is in liquidation and they owed salaries to one of the directors, for example, to an amount of $2,500, $2,000 of that amount that is due to the staff member is proved as above the creditor with a secured creditor with a floating charge, so $2,000, and the balance of $500 or whatever is extra will be proved as part of just the normal unsecured creditors. Similar to the leave, if they're entitled to more than $1,500 of leave, if it's anything more than 1.5 will be proved as part of the unsecured creditors. As I said, you can add to that a third question, so whether there's a gain or a surplus or a deficit after all the creditors have been paid. So what we'll consider is whether there's a surplus in which case that will be distributed to the ordinary shareholders. And if there are any preference shareholders, we need to look at the constitution to see whether they rank above the ordinary shareholders or not. Because preferential shareholders basically just means that they've got a preferential right to return on their capital. So if dividends are paid, they've got a preferential claim, but it does not imply that they've got a preferential claim in the case of liquidation, and we need to look at the constitution to see how to treat them. So if there's a surplus, we have to look at, are there any preference shareholders and where do they rank with regards to the ordinary shareholders. Also, if there's ordinary shareholders, whether there are any calls in advance and the treatment of that. If there's a deficit, it means that we did not have enough funds or cash from realizing all the assets to pay off all the creditors. So it means that the owners of the company, so the shareholders, might need to make a contribution towards that deficit. What we need to consider in that case is whether the shares are fully paid up for, and if it's not, we might be able to make a call on those shareholders to make those shares fully paid and to use that extra cash to pay our creditors. If we don't have enough funds from the shareholders to make the deficit good, it just means that the creditors are going to lose money, and then we work backwards. So we start off with the deferred creditors and then the unsecured creditors. They'll be the first guys to lose, to share in the deficit and move up until the deficit has been wiped out. Now, this was just a brief summary of the liquidation process and basically the steps that we'll go through in a liquidation process to see what assets can be realized, who needs to be paid, and whether we sit with a surplus or a deficit. There's going to be more videos also on the treatment of specific things, like, for example, if there's calls in advance, how to treat that, forfeiture of shares. So you can have a look at that. But if there's any questions that you've got on this specific section, please feel free to post questions on My Guru and we'll respond to you in due course.